There were two major theaters in the war. In the East, primarily in Virginia, and in the West, primarily in Tennessee, for fighting for control of the Mississippi River. In this topic, we'll look at how the fighting in the East in Virginia went in that first year, 1861. It soon became obvious that the war in the East would center in Virginia. While the U.S. capital was, of course, in D.C., the Confederates decided to move their capital from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia, just after Virginia entered the war. In some ways, this was a reward for seceding, but it was also for more government control over the way the war was waged. If you have the central government down in Montgomery and their fighting is in the border states, and in Virginia, it's hard to have much control. So here you see a picture of Richmond in 1860, and the state capitol, I'm going to talk about here in a second, is in the background, you can see. This state capitol became the Confederate capital, and you can see a picture about this time. I should note as well that Richmond had the Tredegar Iron Works, which was important for manufacturing some of the weapons in the South. So they had a real importance of defending Richmond. Richmond and D.C. are only 90 miles apart. A fact that was sure to make the fighting in Northern Virginia really some of the most intense of the war. Both sides wanted to defend their respective capitals, so a lot of troops were already massed there. Some have suggested that the North's manpower advantage just gave them more opportunity elsewhere in the West, which we'll talk about in a subsequent video. As the summer began of 1861, really the spring ends, most of the fighting had been relatively small battles in Kentucky and Missouri and in Western Virginia. I talked about Robert E. Lee having trouble there. But soon both armies began to mass around Washington, D.C. Lincoln appointed General Irvin McDowell to command the troops defending Washington. McDowell remained under the command of Winfield Scott overall, but as the war went on, Scott was, like I said, just too old and sick to lead troops. Scott was in the total command, but he did devise a plan to attack up the Mississippi, sort of to complement the blockade I'd mentioned in an earlier video. He called it the Anaconda Plan after the snake. Scott said controlling the Mississippi and blockading the other coastal ports would strangle the South. Scott also said controlling the Mississippi would divide the South, west and east. Eventually, the Anaconda Plan argued a starved Southern plantation economy would sue for peace. Although Scott's Anaconda Plan was instigated, as we'll see in the West on the Mississippi River in a later video, Scott was soon relieved of overall command of the U.S. forces. Again, he was just too old. As McDowell took command early in the summer of 1861, the Confederate Army massed at Manassas, a small town about 30 miles west of Washington in northern Virginia. The Confederates had a force of about 22,000 men, led by General Beauregard, who had come up from South Carolina. And McDowell had a force of about 33,000 men, but he warned Lincoln that his men were too green to attack yet. Lincoln knew that all the Confederates had to do really was to successfully defend their border, so he urged McDowell to attack. And prodded by Lincoln, McDowell's army began to move westward towards Manassas from Washington, D.C. The Confederates took up defensive positions behind Bull Run River, which flowed near Manassas. And that was where McDowell attacked on July 21st, 1861. The resulting battle is called the First Battle of Manassas. That's what the South calls it. In the First Battle of Bull Run by the North, Confederates tended to name their battles after towns and Unions after geographical areas. Obviously, because I called it the first battle, there'll be a second battle there, but I'll talk about that in a subsequent video. The Battle of First Bull Run ended up being a major Confederate victory. At first, McDowell's troops had the advantage, but he didn't realize that trains from the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia were bringing General Beauregard 12,000 Confederate reinforcements, led by Joseph E. Johnston, shown here. It was the first time in history trains had been used to move armies very, very quickly. While the battle raged, a Confederate general, Thomas Jackson, rallied his Virginia troops when another officer cried, "Look, there's Jackson, standing like a stone wall," trying to rally his own men. The name stuck, and so Thomas Jackson became known as Stonewall Jackson. You can see him here. We'll talk more about Generals Johnston and Jackson and also in a subsequent video. The arrival of Johnston's unexpected reinforcements from the Shenandoah Valley turned the tide of battle and broke the Union lines. Many Union soldiers dropped their weapons and fled. Expecting both an easy and quick victory, a number of prominent Washington politicians and society people had accompanied the army westward, sort of to sit on a hill and, watch the great victory unfold, planning a picnic or something. When the Union lines broke, the soldiers came flooding through the panicked civilians. When he heard of the battle, Jefferson Davis rushed to Manassas and concluded that his troops were too tired to pursue the Union troops into D.C. Many people have said that the failure to do so cost the Confederates a great chance to capture D.C. Union troops are disorganized, etc., and fleeing, and they probably could have walked right in. The end of the battle showed that Beauregard's Confederates had lost about 2,000 men to McDowell's 3,000. That didn't seem like much when we know what happened in the rest of the Civil War, but that shocked people at the time. Suddenly everybody was beginning to fear that, hey, maybe this will be a long, bloody war after all, not so quick and easy. Here you can see a picture of the Bull Run battlefield after the battle. Often photographers would come out and photograph the battlefield after the troops had left. Here you can see a northern newspaper report of defeat and flight reporting on it all. And as I say, people began to realize with such reports that this wasn't going to be easy. After the first Battle of Bull Run, Lincoln relieved McDowell of command and made General George B. McClellan his new commander. His army near Washington was named the Army of the Potomac. McClellan was known as Little Mac. He was diminutive, but he was full of confidence, as you can sort of see in this picture here. McClellan was named leader of the Army of the Potomac, as I say, which you can see here. And McClellan, he was an outstanding administrator and organizer who immediately began organizing and training a much better army. He was, however, resistant to attack, and he had mastered all the details, but he just seemed to train and train the rest of the year, 1861. And this annoyed Lincoln, who once again was urging action. The tensions between Lincoln and McClellan had already begun to build. After the Battle of First Bull Run in July 1861, another smaller battle took place up the Potomac River in October 1861, the Battle of Ball's Bluff. Ball's Bluff, as I say, was not a big battle, and it probably would not be worth noting except that it was another disastrous Union defeat. A congressman's son was killed, which many people said was the result of poor commanders. Here you can see a cemetery of the Ball's Bluff today. The result was that Congress set up the Committee on the Conduct of the War to investigate why the war had started so badly. The Union general of Ball's Bluff was unfairly couched as a traitor and was imprisoned, even though he was never really charged with the crime. The Committee on the Conduct of the War and its punishment sent a chilling message throughout other Union commanders. This was going to be no ordinary war. Those who failed on the battlefield would be personally punished, it appeared. Some have suggested this was what made commanders like McClellan more hesitant to act. This Battle of Ball's Bluff was the last conflict, really, in the Eastern or Virginia theater throughout the remainder of 1861. So this concludes the video on the initial fighting in Virginia in 1861.